Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to this Citizen Science Showcase event. My name is Miranda and I'm here from the Natural History Consortium who have organised the showcase. The Citizen Science Showcase is a programme of events taking place this week, and it's bringing together hundreds of people online and at various sites across the region to help connect people with meaningful projects that help us better understand the natural world through making or investigating scientific records. The showcase is part of the Citizen Science Local Pilot. That's a wider project working to support improvements to citizen science across Somerset, Wiltshire, Dorset and the west of England. And this is supported by Natural England and funded by the government's Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Programme. So just a reminder to everyone that this webinar is being recorded. There will be time at the end for questions, so please put these into the chat as we go. And I'm now going to hand over to Rob and Karen, who are going to tell us about the National Amphibian and Reptile Monitoring Programme in Wessex.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Just bear with me one moment, just while I make sure we've got everything in order. Okay, super. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Rob. I work for Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. I'm joined by my colleague Karen this evening, who's also going to be assisting. And this evening we're talking about the National Amphibian and Reptile Monitoring Programme. So the opportunities to get involved in recording and monitoring amphibians and reptiles, particularly within the Wessex area. And thank you to Miranda and colleagues for organising this event. So during tonight's talk, I'm going to talk briefly about the species we have here in Britain and the UK, but we won't have too much time, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, and then talk specifically about those opportunities to record our native reptiles and amphibians. Now, some of you may not be familiar with Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. We're a national wildlife non-profit or charity dedicated to the conservation of our native amphibians, reptiles and their habitats. We have around 50 staff nationally, manage around 80 nature reserves, and work in everything from policy, education, through to species monitoring, and so on. Within Britain, we have 13 native amphibian and reptile species, so 7 amphibians you can see over there on the left, and 6 reptile species. Within the Wessex area, we find 12 out of these 13 species, so everything except for the pool frog, the northern pool frog, which is just over there on the left-hand side. That's only found at a couple of sites in East Anglia where it's been part of a reintroduction project for the past 20 years or so. As we're not going to have too much time to go through in detail about the identification and ecology of our native species, I wanted to highlight that on our website at this address here on our training page, we have lots of resources, all of them free to access, including this free ID guide. There are training modules you can undertake. There's links to some of our previous webinars and other training videos on our YouTube channel. And also do keep an eye out for other training events as well that we run online and in person. I'm also not going to go into detail tonight about the various non-native amphibian and reptile species we have in Britain, but there are a number of them, so worth being aware of those as well if you are out looking for amphibians and reptiles, because you may come across them and sometimes they can be confused for our native species. But let's have a look at each of our 13 native species just briefly. So for each of our species, I'm just going to highlight roughly their distribution within Britain, using some fairly old maps here, but it does give you the general flavour of where they're distributed. I'm going to talk briefly about their status in Britain, and then just a little bit about their identification and ecology. So first of all, the common lizard, one of our 3 native lizard species, also called the viviparous lizard. It's fairly widespread, as you can see from the map over on the left-hand side. And in terms of status, it's what we refer to as least concern. So it's fairly widespread. There's lots of them. Therefore, we're not worried about it going extinct anytime soon, at least within Britain. Of course, there are localized issues, though, with certain populations. And you can find these in a variety of habitats, in heathland, woodland, grassland, scrubland, all sorts of areas, really. Most semi-natural habitats can be suitable for them. And they're very hardy. They're actually the most northerly lizard species globally, up into the Arctic Circle in some places. In comparison, the sand lizard is a slightly more stocky species, slightly larger too than the common lizard. The males can go this really nice vivid green, as you can see in that top photo there, during the breeding season to try and attract the females. And they're much more restricted in their distribution. So mainly in some of the kind of sandy heathlands in Surrey, Dorset and Hampshire, but also in some coastal dune systems, particularly in the Merseyside area and around some of the coastal areas in Wales too. But because they're so restricted, we do consider them to be endangered in England and vulnerable in Wales. Our last lizard species, which is often confused for a snake, is the slowworm. It's actually a legless lizard, one that many people actually encounter in their gardens or allotments because they do thrive actually in urban and suburban and brownfield areas. They'll quite happily live in your compost heap, and they do like to eat slugs. That's always a bonus. Fairly widely distributed throughout England, Wales and Scotland, getting a bit more patchy in their distribution as we go north. But because they are so widely distributed, they're considered least concern as well. So again, we're not too worried about the conservation status nationally. Moving on to our snake species, we have 3 snake species. First of all, our largest terrestrial reptile, the grass snake. This is widely distributed across England and Wales. Patchy though, going to northern England, and a kind of uncertain status and distribution in Scotland. So least concern in England and Wales there. And most likely to find these kind of around ponds, canals, or compost heaps. They do like to feed on fish and amphibians. Our only venomous snake next then is the adder. So you can see there a male on the left and a female on the right in their kind of most typical coloration. Very widespread across England and Wales and Scotland. Some localised losses or extinctions in some counties, though, unfortunately. And therefore, they're vulnerable in England and near threatened everywhere else. And our last snake species, our rarest reptile, the smooth snake, found only in southern heathlands in Dorset, Hampshire, Surrey, and a couple of sites in Devon and Sussex. Mainly feeds on other reptiles and fairly elusive, really. So, yes, unsurprisingly endangered within England, not found anywhere else in Britain. Moving on to our amphibians, starting with some of the ones you might be more familiar with. So the common frog, as you can see from the map there, widespread across the whole of Britain, fairly common in a variety of habitats, and therefore least concern. Similarly, the common toad is also fairly widespread, and again in many habitats, but though it is considered to be near threatened in England and Scotland due to some declines. Moving on to the rarer frogs and toads, or the rarer toads I should say here, is the natterjack toad. So this species is restricted to salt marsh habitats and sand dune systems where it breeds in the sand dune ponds, or what we call slacks. So mainly restricted to areas of southern England, East Anglia, and up into Merseyside, all the way up to the Solway area of southwest Scotland, and endangered. Then our rarest amphibian or reptile species, the northern pool frog, This is found only at a couple of sites in East Anglia where we've reintroduced it along with partners, and therefore it's critically endangered. Finally, onto our newts, we have 3 native newt species. First of all, the one that probably people are most familiar with, either due to the press or just being a bit more charismatic perhaps. So this is the great crested newt. It's a European protected species, so it gets a higher level of protection than some of our other amphibian species, at least the other 2 newt species. Much larger than the other 2 newt species, and some real distinctive characteristics such as this crest along the back of the male during the breeding period in the water, which then has a gap at the base of the tail, and then the crest starts again. And as we'll see when we compare that to the smooth newt has a continuous crest all the way from head to tail. There's a few other characteristics as well, which I don't really have time to go into, unfortunately, but fairly widely distributed across England, much of Wales, and into parts of Scotland too. And least concern, because although it is a European protected species, it is still fairly widespread within Britain. Next, on to our 2 small newt species, as we might refer to them, because they are much smaller than the great crested newt. Both the smooth newt and the palmate newt are fairly widely distributed within Britain. So firstly here, the smooth newt, it's got this, as I said, this continuous crest for the male during the breeding season in the water. It doesn't have that break at the base of the tail. And it is least concern because it is widely distributed. Then onto the palmate newt, again widely distributed. And some interesting characteristics for the breeding males here again is that it has this filament at the end of the tail, you can see here on the right hand side, and these large kind of webbed feet on the back, on their back legs, hence the name palmate. Again, least concern. So that's a whirlwind tour of our 13 native amphibian and reptile species. As I said, do take a look at the other resources on our website to learn more, or look at some of our other training sessions that are on offer. But now I'd like to talk to you about the National Amphibian and Reptile Monitoring Programme, or the National Programme as I refer to it because it's quite a mouthful. So the National Programme is our portfolio of different surveys and projects designed to help us collect the data that we need as a conservation organisation to assess and understand the status of our native amphibians and reptiles, basically to generate that evidence base we need to inform policy, to inform habitat management, all those sorts of things to try and do our best for these species. And so this evidence base that we try and develop by collecting data either through volunteers, through our own work, through work with partners, that helps us understand where the species live, so their range and distribution, how their populations might be changing, their habitat needs, and that then can feed into things like policy and land management, again, to try and conserve the species and their habitats as best as we can. Now, within Wessex, I want to give a few examples of species distributions in this area. So you can see here we've got Somerset, Dorset and Wiltshire in view here. And this map shows the number of reptile and amphibian species, noting that the maximum could be 13 within each 10 kilometres square within the region. And so we can see down here in the south and southwest in Dorset and over into parts of Hampshire, in some areas we've actually got all 12 species that you could expect to find in this area, bearing in mind that the 13th species would be the northern poolfrog, which is only in East Anglia at present. But in other areas, such as parts of Somerset and Wiltshire, we have at least recorded much fewer species. So that could be down to the fact that literally those species maybe don't occur in those areas, but it could be down to a gap in recording. So I'm using this to try and demonstrate that at its most basic, going out and recording those species can help us understand this pattern of distribution for our species and might help fill some gaps. And I want to illustrate that with a couple more examples. So over on the left here, we have the distribution of the common frog. This is verified records from the last 10 years or so. So those large orange circles, each one represents a 10 kilometre square where we've had a verified record, a confirmed record of common frog. And the small orange circles are 10 kilometre squares where we've had a record, but it's not verified. So perhaps there wasn't a photo or not sufficient evidence for us to be certain that record was correct. And so here again, even though the species is widespread, we can still see there's areas where additional survey effort could be useful, even at that coarse scale, to help us make have a better understanding of the distribution in those areas. And if we were to then look at this at, say, a 1 kilometre scale, there'd be even more patchiness in that distribution. So these data at the most basic level at least help us understand distribution among many other things. In comparison, another widespread species, but more patchily distributed, the adder on the right-hand side there, you can see we've got some much larger gaps actually for the species, both verified and just complete lack of records in some places. So again, it just highlights that recording is very useful, even just understanding these elements of the species. So I've mentioned some ways in which we can use data, and I really want to just highlight that reptiles and amphibians are generally very under-recorded. They're perhaps not as charismatic as some other species or groups such as birds and butterflies, which people often record quite regularly. And throughout the rest of this presentation, I want to showcase some of the different ways you can get involved in recording, everything from just if you were out walking your dog and you spot something, you want to record it so you know where to do so, versus getting involved in or what we call structured surveys, where you're doing multiple surveys with a fixed protocol to follow. Now, before I do that, I also wanted to demonstrate another way that data from monitoring can be used. So this is from a piece of research we did about 3 years ago for a project called Snakes in the Heather. It was a lottery funded project. And what we did is we took our understanding of where the species had been recorded, so those kind of dots on maps, and we used that with other environmental data and land cover data to make a prediction about the most suitable areas for, in this case, adders across the whole of southern England. So these darker colours represent areas where we think there is higher suitability for adders. And we did the same thing for smooth snakes and for sand lizards. So again, the data collected through recording in all its forms can be useful in this kind of research as well. Before we move on, I also wanted to highlight that recording data, in most places, wherever you record it, it will get shared and used for multiple purposes. So for example, if you were recording data within ARC's National Amphibian and Reptile Monitoring Programme, so it might come through Record Pool or Garden Dragon Watch or one of our national surveys, or it might come via iRecord or our naturalist. Those data will come in and get shared with us, so we can use them to inform our decision making and use that for conservation purposes. But those data are also then shared to a public platform called the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, of which we're a member. That allows anyone to access and download that data and use it for research or other purposes, for non-commercial purposes. And then we also try and make sure we've got good relationships with local environmental record centres, which are normally county-based. So, for example, Dorset Environmental Record Centre, to make sure those data are shared with them to inform local authorities, to inform planning, and so on. So we do try and make sure that data is shared and used, as well as making data available to be requested directly from us for a variety of purposes. Before I mention the specific ways in which we can record data, whether you're recording amphibians, reptiles, or any other species, there's typically the same pieces of information that are needed to make up what we call a biological record. So we would need to know who recorded it, so that would be your name, what it is that you've recorded, so the name of the species, or if you're not completely certain of the species, it can be the type of organism you found. So it could be, well, I saw a small lizard, I saw a small newt, I saw what I think was a snake. If possible, you can also include information about the quantity, the life stage, the sex of the species you've seen. The location is also very important, and that can be ideally a high-resolution grid reference, which shows the kind of pinpoint location of the record, but can also be a place name, a site name, a postcode, anything like that as well, if you don't have the finer detail. The date is very important as well, where possible the time also, but the date is much more important than the time. And also how you made that record. So was it a visual observation? You're just out looking in your garden, perhaps, or your allotment, or out for a walk? Were you doing a specific survey and you're using a torch to look for amphibians in a pond at night? That kind of thing. And you can always include additional information, such as what the weather was like, the habitat, anything about the health or behavior of the species. And especially if you're uncertain about what you found, or you're quite new to recording, it's very valuable to take a photo and share that, and we can use that to verify the record and say, yep, that certainly was, in this case, a slow one that person recorded. Okay, so on to the different ways you can actually get involved in recording. So starting at the kind of, I guess, bottom of the ladder, if you like, we have what we might refer to as casual recording, or ad hoc recording in some cases. And there are various ways you can record these kind of observations. So again, as if you're out for a walk, you've recorded something in your garden or disturbed something, whatever it might be, or even if you are doing it slightly more rigorously, you can still go via these routes. So you could record it on a platform called Record Pool. This is a website that we run in partnership with Amphibian and Reptile Groups UK. Similarly, you can record things via iRecord or iNaturalist, which are not restricted just to just amphibians or reptiles. They're for any wildlife, plants, fungi, everything. If you're looking to get involved in more of a project, if you like, you can get involved in Garden Dragon Watch. This is a project we launched during lockdown, and it's to encourage people to record what's in their gardens, in their allotments, in their school grounds, spending around 10 minutes just having a look and recording what you see. And then above that, and I'll focus a bit more on this later, are our more structured surveys. So surveys where you're following a set protocol, carrying out repeated visits within a year to the same location, and ideally over multiple years within suitable habitats. So that's our National Reptile Survey and our National Amphibian Survey, and in some parts of the country also things like our Natterjack Toad Monitoring Programme and so on. So coming back to Record Pool, I mentioned this is a partnership project. It's simply a case of just going to this website and you can fill in the information. And again, that is shared with all the relevant partners. For Garden Dragon Watch, it's just a very simple online form on our website. And then for our more structured surveys, the National Amphibian Survey and National Reptile Survey, we have a form that we've developed accessible through an app which you can use on your mobile phone, your tablet, or your computer called Survey 123. That allows us to have a very customized form. And basically, you can record the results of your surveys on that, and I'll show you a bit more about that later. So the National Reptile Survey is our national survey designed to allow us to understand changes in populations and distribution for all of our widespread reptiles. So that includes the slow worm, the common lizard, the adder, and the grass snake. But it doesn't restrict it to just those species, so any other reptiles or amphibians encountered can also be recorded through that. And what we're working towards is a network of sites nationally so that we can then produce an output which tells us what's going on nationally in terms of changes and try and be representative of those changes. To have those repeated visits across multiple years. And for anyone who might have heard of NARS, or the National Amphibian and Reptile Recording Scheme, which is a scheme we ran from 2007 to around 2020, this just builds on and replaces the reptile element of that. So if you heard of NARS, this is basically the next evolution of that. So for the National Reptile Survey, we asked people to try and achieve 6 survey visits within a year between March and October, recording all the reptile observations you make along a survey route. And that includes looking visually for reptiles as you go, and where possible, also using what we call artificial cover objects. And those are simply just sheets of roofing material or other materials that are going to get nice and warm, and then reptiles are going to find them a nice place to go and rest, and that makes detecting some species a bit easier. In terms of experience, all you really need is to be confident in being able to identify and record UK reptile species. And that is covered by some of the other materials we have online, by some of the other training sessions we have. So if you're interested and you don't feel you're at quite that level yet, do look at those resources. And I'll link again to these at the end of the presentation. And recording as part of the National Reptile Survey, I already mentioned that we have a form in this Survey 123 app. But if you're not too happy with using the technology, you can still record via paper form or send us an email with the results. But we do try and steer people towards the Survey 123 form where possible because it's designed specifically for the survey. And then simply as you're walking along your survey route, as you'll see a bit later, you record your observations as you go. So for example, if I've walked and I found a common lizard at 10:05, I would record that, carry on, lifted a sheet of metal perhaps, found 3 slow worms, recorded that, and so on until you finished your survey. The National Amphibian Survey, as you'll see, is very similar in structure. So again, we're trying to develop a picture of how populations and distributions are changing for the species, focusing on our widespread species, particularly the common frog, common toad, and the 2 small newt species, so the palmate newt and smooth newt. But it may also include the great crested newt in some places if that's present, noting that as a European protected species, you do require a license to survey and disturb great crested newts. If that's the case, if you do end up surveying a location that has the species present and you're doing it as part of one of our surveys, do get in touch because we can look at training opportunities and perhaps accrediting you under our organisational protected species licence. The way that we offer people to get involved in the National Amphibian Survey is that we split the frog and toad survey and the newt survey into 2 different elements. But in most people, they will actually just do both together. But let me explain. So frogs and toads are generally active a bit earlier than newts. For example, actually, we know that frogs are breeding now in lots of places this time of year. So we ask people to go and try and achieve 4 survey visits to their ponds between January and March, just visually looking at their ponds during the day and using torches at night time, recording all life stages of amphibians you come across, including spawn, adults, tadpoles, etc. For newts, it's very similar. It's just a slightly later time period generally. So generally from April to May, although saying that, the palmate newts in my pond are probably ready to breed this week, I think, judging by how they've been acting. So again, going out using a torch at night time is a really effective way of finding newts in ponds. You can do daylight visual searches. Then if you have a net available, you can also look at using a net as a kind of a supplementary method as well. So recording newts, their larvae and their eggs. And But as I say, what most people do is they'll simply opt to do 6 visits total between January and May, recording any and all amphibians, so frogs, toads, and newts. And that's the kind of way we expect most people to do it. But if you just want to do frogs and toads, or just want to do newts, that's fine. The one other aspect of the National Amphibian Survey is that we do ask our surveyors to undertake one habitat assessment per year at their pond. This is simply a one-page form that you have to fill out, and it's fairly basic. It gives lots of instructions. That just gives us an idea of the suitability of the pond for different species and the habitat quality. And again, all that recording is done through these Survey 123 forms, but there are paper forms available. And in this case, what you're doing is you're going to your pond, you're carrying out one method, so say a visual survey of your pond, recording what you see from that one method. Then you can come back and do another method, for example, a torchlight survey in the evening, record everything you see from that torchlight survey, and so on. It doesn't have to be on the same days, obviously. It can be spread out across that period. I'd like to then just talk you through how to get involved if you're keen and interested about what you're hearing this evening. So the first step to getting involved in any of our surveys, really, so the National Amphibian Survey or the National Reptile Survey, is to complete our online registration form, and that's at the web link shown at the bottom of the page here, and I'll share it again at the end of the presentation. You'll then be put in touch with our survey coordinator teams. That's myself, Karen, and our colleague Fenella. We'll set you up with access to all of our resources. We'll make sure you've got a site set up, and then you can go out, carry out surveys, report your results, and see the results as well. And I'll show you that shortly. And in the form, you can see there's options to actually tick if you're interested in the National Amphibian Survey or the National Reptile Survey. I should say that the other survey options I mentioned earlier, so Record Pool, has its own kind of sign up on the page, and iRecord and so on. They've got their own systems there. You don't have to complete our registration form to submit data through those. If you are interested in taking part in one of our national surveys, one of the first challenges, if you like, or one of the first things to tick off the list is to identify a site. Now, for both the National Amphibian Survey and National Reptile Survey, we have a network of random survey squares across the country. So there's hundreds or thousands of them. So there's always opportunities to find one of these random sites. And I'll show you these in more detail in a moment in the actual live map. So as a first choice, we would ask you to try and see if you can choose from our random survey squares in your local area. And there'll always be some that are fairly near you, or we can always try and find a new site. If you can't find a suitable random square, you can also choose a site that we've had previously surveyed, so we can then continue the data collection of that site that's been historically surveyed, or you can suggest another site that you're interested in or have in mind already. If perhaps you're an existing surveyor already doing amphibian or reptile surveys, then there's a fairly high likelihood that your survey will already be compatible with the National Amphibian Survey or National Reptile Survey. So if you would like to bring that survey in under the umbrella of these surveys, then do just get in touch with us, the email address there at the bottom of the page, and then we can hopefully bring your site and your surveys in under the national surveys and offer you the resources as well that we have available. And if you happen to be a land manager and you would like more information about the amphibians and reptiles on your land, then you can get in touch. We can basically map out your site in our system and then advertise that to volunteers to come and survey that site on your behalf, hopefully. Okay, so I just want to talk about some of the resources that we've got available as well to help support our surveyors. And these are primarily accessible through our website, an area that we call the ARC Survey Hub. It's simply just a series of web pages that contain all the information about the National Monitoring Programme and the various different surveys within it. Within that, we've got some information that you can access publicly. So information like our survey protocols, what's expected of you, how to register, the maps of all the random squares, all that information, and I'll show that in a moment. And once you're signed up, it's also where you can access all your survey data, any maps that are associated with the survey you're involved with, and also, in some cases, access or information about how to use the apps that support our surveys. So I'm now going to take you on a brief virtual tour on some of these elements. So bear with me just while I switch windows. So hopefully you can see this web page I've now got up here. I'm sure someone will shout if it's not showing. And let me just check there's no messages in the chat that need attention. No, perfect. Okay. So this, for example, is the National Reptile Survey public webpage on the ARC Survey Hub. And I'm signed in with an account, as you would be if you were a surveyor within the project, but you would still be able to see this page publicly. We've got a link to our survey protocol just here. We've got a link to our volunteer registration form, the registration form I mentioned a couple of slides ago. Some basic information about the survey, what's involved, a quick summary of the protocol here. And at the bottom here is this link to those random survey squares that I mentioned. So, and I'm going to show you that now. So if I open that tab, it will so if you were to click on that button, find a random survey square, it'll take you through to this map here. Now, the first thing you see is a little window that gives you information about how to use this web page. I won't show it too long, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom into the Wessex area. You can actually put your postcode in, just search within a kind of a distance of your local area. And you can see there's lots and lots of random 1 kilometre squares everywhere. And so these are ones for the reptile survey. We've got a similar map for the amphibian survey. And for example, if I was to say maybe I lived in the Clevedon area and I was to find a local site to survey, maybe I picked this one on the coast here. And so my first thought would be, well, actually, is there anywhere suitable that I can survey for reptiles? And actually, I would say this bit of coastline here, that could be worth looking for reptiles. You know, there's some potentially suitable habitat there. So the next step would be trying to work out who the landowner is. It might be National Trust, it might be local authority, get their permission, and then we can hopefully get a survey going at that location. As I say, if you struggle to find a local option to survey within these random squares, get in touch and we can look at other options as well in the local area. But the starting point really is to choose from these random squares. Again, there's another one up here, so perhaps we could look at, there's an area within this edge of this woodland that might be suitable for reptile surveys. I can see a few spots as a reptile surveyor that I might pick. Down the bottom left-hand corner here looks quite suitable actually. And all you need to do is from this map, you click on the square you're interested in. It will come with a pop-up, this window that pops up, and there'll be a link to email through to our survey coordinator. That's myself and my colleagues. That will then send an email through saying, hello, I would like to survey square ST4575 in this instance. And then we'll get back to you and say, yep, that's great. Let's get you signed up. And that's kind of how you can get involved. So we've got exactly the same process for the National Amphibian Survey too. The other thing I quickly want to show you is that once you are signed in, once you're part of the survey, you'll see this surveyors page button, this big orange one. So if I was to click that, that would take me through to this page here. And on here is all the additional resources available to our surveyors. So again, we've got the same thing for our amphibian survey, but I'm just showing the reptile survey just for simplicity here. We've got all the resources you might need, so various survey resources, survey protocols, paper forms that you can print out, training resources, ID guides, all those kinds of things. They're all stored in one place for you to access easily. Perhaps the most important thing is a link through to your map. So that might be the National Reptile Survey Somerset map or the National Reptile Survey Gloucestershire map. It depends on your region. We'll put you in a group based on your region. So you're in that kind of survey community. And that map will contain all the information about your survey site. So we'll have your survey sites. If you're doing an amphibian survey, you should show the location of your ponds once they've been mapped out. For reptile surveys, it will show your survey routes, which I'll show you in just one moment. So bear with me 1 second just while this loads. I did mean to preload this, but I forgot, so do forgive me. Right, here we go. So the map I'm going to show you now is purely for training purposes. These are all hypothetical sites. None of them, although it's based on a real map, none of them, to my knowledge, have actually got surveys going on at them. So please don't go and try and seek out these sites for surveys. If I go to one of these random sites, so here is a hypothetical site that I've mapped out. It's called Training Site 1. We've got a white boundary around the edge, which is approximately the boundary of the site itself. We've mapped what we might call a survey area, which is this orange survey. So this is for a reptile survey, I should mention. So the survey area is normally what we might identify as kind of the area we think we can manageably survey within one visit, perhaps the area with the best habitat or the highest likelihood of finding species. We've then also mapped out a survey route, which is this line in blue. So that's the route I'm going to approximately walk each time I do my survey. Then each of these orange squares is an artificial cover object, a sheet of roofing material. So I'm going to walk along my route, looking for reptiles as I go, checking the sheets as I go, and then recording what I see. The amphibian map in comparison will simply just have your sites and then your ponds. Okay, so next thing I want to show you then is we're now going to do a virtual survey. So let's do a very quick virtual survey. So let's do a virtual reptile survey to start with. Now, if I was going out to do a survey, I need to be fairly good at planning ahead. So I've got my survey site set up, I've got my permissions, I've done my risk assessments, I've got my survey form on my notebook or my mobile app or whatever else I might want to use to record my results. I should mention as well that the maps I just showed you are also available on a mobile app that we make available called Field Map. So you can use exactly the same map in the field and it'll actually show your GPS location as you move around. So if you're not familiar with the site, that can be really useful to help you find your pond or find your artificial cover objects and also map additional things on your site. So here we are again at my hypothetical training site. And whether you're using your map on the computer or on a mobile device, these maps are all interactive. So what I can do is I can click on my survey site, and as a quick way for me to fill in the survey form for this site, so say I've been to do a survey at training site 1, I have a big orange button here that says Start Reptile Survey. And what that does is it tells my computer, or if I'm in the field, my phone or my laptop, my tablet, to open up the Survey 123 app, which is the app we use for our recording forms. And I won't have time to go into detail about it tonight, but we've got lots of resources online about how to use this form, how to fill it in. And what it's done is it's told this mobile app or this desktop computer app which survey I'm doing. So it knows I'm doing National Reptile Survey. It knows who I am. ARC Training is my name this evening. It knows what site I'm surveying at, Training Site 1. And it automatically assumes that I'm starting my survey now. And obviously, if I'm filling this in after a survey, I can adjust that. I can then go through to page 2 of the form and I'm ready to start adding records. And it actually shows me a list of all the artificial cover objects I've got laid out on the site so I can make sure that I'm covering them all during my survey. Now, if I go back to my, wrong screen, back to my map here. So here is my site again. So I've started my survey, I've filled up the first page of the form, that's all correct. And I'm walking along my survey route. Hopefully on a nice sunny day like I had yesterday here in Devon, and I've come across my first artificial cover object. And I carefully check underneath it, noting there might be adders there. And we're very lucky. First sheet we've got a nice big female adder under there. Okay, so how do I record that? Well, in my Survey 123 app, I click on this plus button underneath Add a Record. I choose Artificial Cover Object from the Encounter method. I choose tin number 1 from the list, or sheet number 1. It knows where sheet number 1 is because that's stored in our database. I can always correct that if it's wrong. And I'm simply going to tell it I found an adder, 1 adult. And I can add all the information I want about it in this form. What sex it was, I can add photos if I want, and so on, and any comments. I don't press anything now until I have another record to add. So what I would do then is carry on my survey. Just close this, there we go. And then carry on, and let's say, for example, I found this common lizard, which is out basking. So this is a visual observation. In this case, I'm just going to copy and paste this grid reference just to save a bit of time. But obviously, you could have that written down in a notebook, or if you're actually in the field, you can use the GPS position on your phone or your tablet to locate that for you. You don't actually have to type in any coordinates or anything in the form. It'll just pick up your GPS position directly. And I'm going to click on the plus button down here to say I'm adding a new record from a different time or location. I'm going to choose visual. I could change the time at the record time there, obviously, to something more sensible if I've been out for a proper survey. If I was in the field, I could press this little crosshairs icon and it would use my GPS position. Unfortunately, I'm sat in my home office in Devon, so it's not going to give you a very exciting location. So I'm going to click on the map here and I'm going to put in my postcode. Now, I'm not expecting any of you to obviously remember all this bits of training. This will all be recorded, and there's lots of other information available online about how to use this and further training. So don't worry, this isn't a crash course on how to use the app completely. It's just to give you a flavour of what you can do for these surveys. So I put in my grid reference, and that blue marker looks about the right place for my common lizard sighting. So I click on my little tick box in the bottom right hand corner, and it saved that location. And again, I can add that I've recorded a common lizard. I can add all the other information I need to about it. It's simply then a case of completing your survey, going all the way along your survey route, which I won't do now just for time, recording everything you see until you finish your survey, and then submitting your survey results at the end. So I could have gone through, recorded lots of other things, hopefully. Also recording negative records. So if I picked up a sheet, there was nothing there, I'd mark it and say no records. You can also mark multiple different species in one place, and so on. So at the end of that survey, I'm going to go to the last page of this survey form. I would fill in some information about the weather. I'll just skip that for now. Say that I did a visual survey with artificial cover objects. Add my end time, and it will calculate how long my survey was. Only 4 minutes. That's not very good, is it? And then click yes, I recorded all the reptiles I saw. Click on this tick button, and then when I'm ready, I can press send now, and it will submit it into our database. So it's real-time data transfer. That will then get updated in all our systems, and so on. The great thing about this Survey 123 app is you can also use it completely offline. So if you're worried about using mobile data, or you don't have an internet connection, you can, as long as you've got the form downloaded before you go into the field and it's updated, you can use it all completely offline. Wait till you're at home with Wi-Fi or in your office, and send it then. Okay, just for the last few minutes then, I just want to give you a very quick whirlwind tour of doing the same thing but for amphibians. So again, make sure you've got your forms, everything you need. In this case, our map is much simpler. So we've got our survey site here with a couple of ponds, these blue areas marked out. All I need to do is click on the pond that I want to survey. So training pond 2, click on start amphibians. It will load up my Survey 123 app again. It knows that I'm doing the National Amphibian Survey, who I am, where my site is. It also knows where my pond is. So it already knows that I'm doing training pond 2. And I simply then just go through and record my observations from around the pond. So for example, I've surveyed my pond using a visual survey. And I found some toad tadpoles, for example. So in my form, I'm going to choose, I need to choose visual survey as my method here. So I've done my visual survey. I found some common toad tadpoles. And obviously tadpoles are quite hard to count, as are spawn. So you just select a quantity as a category. So let's say 101 to 1,000 tadpoles roughly. And then we repeat that for all the observations we make using our visual survey at the pond. Fill in the last bit of details about your survey effort, and then you submit it exactly the same way as we saw with the reptile survey. So it all works very much the same. Once you've completed all your surveys, the last thing I want to show you on the website is at the bottom of this surveyor's page, it also shows you, it gives you access to all the data you've submitted, so you can view it, interact with it, filter it, download it. If you want to share it to the landowner, for example, or keep your own spreadsheet copy, that's all accessible through this app at the bottom of the web page. So I can see here, a couple of years ago during a training session, I recorded an adder and a grass snake at the training site 1 reptile survey. So you can view all your data there, and obviously hopefully over time you'd see you've got lots of sightings, and they will all be in our database. Right, let's go back to our presentation then, just for the last few minutes, then it'll be time for questions. So just to sum up really, hopefully that's given you an idea of the different survey opportunities and ways of recording data. Here's some useful links. I'll also post these in the chat in a moment if anyone wants to copy them. And hopefully we'll also email you out with information about the recording. And so we'll try and share them there as well. But any questions, get in touch via this email address here, surveycoordinator@arctrust.org. But if you're interested in getting involved in national surveys, please do register on our website. There's been a variety of photos here, just to say thank you to all the photographers who've allowed me to use their photos. And we'll also be sharing a feedback link. So as part of the Citizen Science Showcase, Miranda and colleagues are really keen to get your feedback. There's an opportunity to win a voucher for the Natural History Book Store, NHBS, that sells a variety of books and other wildlife-related equipment and tools. So you can either use this QR code, follow this link, or I can see Miranda's shared it in the chat there as well. And we'll try and email that around as well to everyone who's attended this evening. So please do give feedback. And finally, just say thank you for your time. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And between me and Karen, hopefully we can. Thank you. Okay, do we have any questions?
Thank you, Rob. We do have
Super.
some questions.
Great.
And I will just find you. So the first question is from Henry and George, have asked, how do the existing sites have landowner permissions to carry out the surveys, or would we have to obtain those?
That's a very good question. So unfortunately, we don't have the resource ourselves to go kind of and identify for every single site who the landowners are. We have been working with some larger landowning partners to try and get permissions across, some of those, some of their land holdings to try and speed things up in some cases. But it does depend on the site. We'll certainly help you as best we can in finding out who the landowner might be, but local knowledge can really be useful in that case. Many sites are likely to be owned by, local authority, local council, perhaps a larger landowner such as National Trust or something like that, or Natural England, or Natural Resources Wales, if in Wales, for example. But yes, we can help you if you kind of hit a dead end. On the resources that are provided as part of being a surveyor under our surveys, we also have a permissions form and a permissions letter. So that acts as kind of an introductory letter which you can share with the landowner once you have identified them, that shows that you are contributing to a national survey. You're not just asking so you can wander around by yourself that isn't involved with anything else. So we do try and support you as best we can, but unfortunately with so many sites, we don't currently have the resource to go through and identify every single landowner. So yes, do see if you can identify them yourselves, using local knowledge, knocking on doors if need be, or looking at local maps. But otherwise, do get in touch and we can try and help you with that.
Thank you. And our next question is about the use of artificial cover objects in surveys. Will they be skewing the data? The person has wondered whether the quantity of adders and slow worms would be relative to the number of cover objects used.
That's a very good question. So first of all, yes, it is. You are kind of biasing your survey to areas with higher detectability of the species generally. Now, ideally, we do want data from other areas too, but the challenge with reptiles particularly, also amphibians to a degree, but reptiles particularly, is they have very low what we call detectability. So they can be very hard to detect, even sometimes to detect one on a site, even if there are many more than one. So we have to kind of skew things in our favour in order to get the best chance of detecting things. Now, the reason that we ask people, one of the reasons we ask people to map out their survey routes as part of the reptile survey, is so that is kind of then a repeatable survey, even if it changes hands to another surveyor over time. So all we're ever doing within a reptile survey, because when you're walking along doing a reptile survey, realistically, you're only ever seeing, say, maybe up to half a metre either side of you in most sites, depending on the kind of topography and the habitat. So you're only ever really sampling a small area of a site, even if the site itself is fairly small. So there's always a bias to that. So we account for that in our data analysis by looking at the length of your survey route. So how long does it take you to complete a survey? How many artificial cover objects you got? So we account for that in the analysis. So we know that, for example, as you say, someone that's laid out 30 artificial cover objects is likely to have a higher rate of finding slow worms, particularly, for example, than someone who's only got 2 or none. So we do account for that. Unfortunately, it's just one of the things we have to incorporate into the survey is this kind of some level of flexibility, because otherwise, if we asked everyone to do exactly the same thing, as we found in the past, it's just really difficult to achieve, really, especially with volunteer surveyors. But another thing, if we had lots and lots of money, we could pay professional consultants to go out and do it, and do it that way. But with volunteers considered and sites being very different, so in some cases a survey site itself might be a 200-meter stretch of a field margin versus a large heathland nature reserve versus a woodland ride. They can be very, very different sites as well. So we have to account for that flexibility too.
Thank you. That's a really comprehensive answer. And the other point to just make on that one as well is with the National Reptile Survey, we're hoping that people will be able to survey it in different years. So a particular point of interest will be how your location changes from year to year. And hopefully you'll be keeping the same number of cover objects in those routes set up once you've established it. So we wouldn't sort of see, so there's a lot of interest in following that site through in itself. So your next question is, how many of the visits would you expect to be at night? And
this is very good.
This is a concern in this case, if being a new surveyor going out at night.
No, absolutely. And so certainly we have a risk assessment a template risk assessment we provide as part of the survey. We would never want anyone to do a survey if they're feeling uncomfortable, whether that's because of access challenges or being on their own, and especially for nighttime surveys. And also working around ponds has other risks as well associated with it, of course, because you're working around water. So you don't have to do night visits. It's one of the recommended survey methods, but your data is still valuable and still usable, even if you've only done daytime visual surveys or just daytime netting, for example. So as I say, just whatever you're comfortable with. We do advise, if anyone is working by themselves as well, to operate a buddy system. But if you can take someone along with you, especially on nighttime survey visits, then that's even better. But absolutely, we would never want to put anyone in a position where they feel uncomfortable. And so the survey is designed that, yes, there are multiple methods you can use, including torchlight surveys at night, but you don't have to. And it's always a case of whatever best fits the situation. The reason that we ask for multiple different survey methods is because, again, as we were talking about with the reptiles, amphibians, particularly different species or different life stages and different times of year, have different levels of what we call detectability. So using a net might be a really good way of finding newts in some places. Going during the daytime might be a good way of looking for newt eggs folded in leaves, or looking for frogs and toads or frog and toad spawn, for example, or tadpoles. So it does vary, and we can just, again, as I mentioned with the artificial cover object question for reptiles, we account for that in our analysis. So we know, okay, with that particular site, we didn't have any torchlight surveys, therefore the detectability of perhaps newts might be a bit lower. So we can account for that in our analysis of, is that species present at the site and is that changing? So as just really to emphasize, please don't do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, but you can still participate in the survey without doing nighttime surveys.
Thanks, Rob. Lots of questions in the chat now.
Right.
So Sarah has said that she's currently doing the amphibian surveys, and she wants to know whether she will use the same site for the reptile survey that she's also expressed interest in. So I'm taking that about whether you have to do the same, if you're doing both surveys, do you have to do it in the same place? Or whether she could.
The simple answer is no, you don't have to, but you're more than welcome to. So you can have a reptile survey at one site, an amphibian survey at another. If you're really, really keen, we do have a handful of volunteers who do multiple sites. Obviously, it depends on your time availability. You could also do multiple ponds within one site. It's completely up to you. But yes, if it works and if it's easier for you as well, because you've already got landowner permission to do amphibian surveys and reptile surveys on the same site, that's absolutely fine. But if you'd rather do them in different places, that's also fine too.
Thank you. And a question about this is really, somebody here has said, what happens if we find a smooth snake at a site? Are we able to survey without a license? And I think we'll probably expand that to really any protected species.
Yeah, sure.
If you can imagine that.
So first of all, you might want to celebrate because they are quite hard to find unless you're in the right place. For smooth snakes, as a specific example, we have pretty much, I'd say, a kind of 95% accuracy of knowing which sites smooth snakes are at. So if you were to sign up and say, can I do this site, and we knew smooth snakes were there, we wouldn't let you go and do the survey without being covered by a license first of all. Same with sand lizard, great crested newt, natterjack toad, all the European protected species. If it happens that you were at a site and we didn't already know that species was there, it does happen on occasion. The highest likelihood of that is for great crested newts. We would say that once you've found that protected species, let us know. You have to stop survey. We will then look at opportunities for you to be trained and accredited under our protected species license. We have around 350 volunteers nationally who operate under our protected species license. So it's a common way that we help people be able to do their surveys. And obviously we have to make sure people are competent and trained appropriately. But yes, if you do find a protected species on a survey and you don't have your own personal license for it, or you're not covered under another license, don't do any more surveys until we've dealt with that issue. But it's a low likelihood, particularly for reptiles. We generally know where all the rare reptiles are.
Thank you. We've got 3 more questions to try and fit in before we pass back to Miranda. And so another one is about how would we get the artificial cover objects for the reptile surveys? And the person has mentioned that she supposes that she'd also need to check with the landowner before using them at her site. Yes. So a bit about practicalities about cover objects.
Sure. So sourcing them, again, this is one of the reasons we allow for flexibility in the surveys, in that firstly, not everyone can get access to artificial cover objects. If you're buying them, they can cost a bit of money. I'll talk briefly about some of the different options and the different costs in a second. But secondly, it is very important that the landowner is happy for you to have them down, particularly if they've got anything like grazing livestock or they're operating machinery where they might damage your sheets. In some public areas, they might get moved or stolen if they're not well hidden away. If it's very windy, they can blow away, all sorts of challenges with artificial cover objects. And also, if you're surveying on certain sites, like sites of special scientific interest or national nature reserves, you have to actually get permission, not just from the site owner, but also from Natural England if you're doing surveys in England, or similar thing in Wales as well, I think. In terms of getting artificial cover objects for your survey, first thing I would do is reach out to any local amphibian and reptile groups, see if they've got any available. In some cases, depending on where you are, we might actually have some available if you've got a local regional presence. But if you're buying them, they can be, they're not necessarily cheap depending on what you're buying. So we don't expect people to fork out money out of their own pockets if they can't find them from another source. If it is a wildlife trust site, they may even be willing to purchase them for you. The cheapest way to get artificial cover objects is to use roofing felt. You can buy it at hardware stores for fairly cheap. A roll of it is fairly easy to carry. You can cut it up, but roofing felt doesn't last particularly long. The most common materials we use as artificial cover objects are what's called coralline or onduline, which is corrugated bitumen roofing material. Otherwise, you can also use sheets of metal, corrugated metal, but that is very expensive and very heavy to carry around too. But that you're not limited to just using those materials. It can be all sorts of things. It can be old bits of carpet, as long as the landowner is happy and obviously thinking about the fact that that might degrade into the environment. It can be pieces of wood. It can be old tiles. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a purchased product to use as artificial cover objects necessarily. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a rough idea. Again, there's some bit more advice in the survey protocol on our website, but do get in touch if you have any issues, and we can see if we can find anyone in your area that might be able to lend you some. For example, I've got 300 outside my house, which I think sources pretty much the whole of Devon. So if you're in Devon, do get in touch.
So we've got a question from somebody who is starting a new landscape recovery project. And they want to be monitoring wildlife in it for the next 20 years, including amphibians and reptiles. Can they join our survey, or do you want us just to stick to your squares?
Yes, please. We would love to have you on board with the survey. I say the squares are kind of the priority from a statistical side, but we are still very open to any other sites taking part. So please do sign up, and we'd love to have you on board.
And the last question we have in the list, who is responsible for placing artificial covers, permissions for placing and maintaining, providing the materials?
Okay, so I mean, hopefully I partly covered that in what I was saying previously. So unless you happen to be in an area where we've got local staff resource, that's mainly Dorset, South Wales, North Wales, a few other areas around the country, then we might not be able to kind of help with that directly ourselves. We can help advise, from say aerial maps, for example, as to where best to place them. But generally, it does fall down to the surveyor. So I'd always recommend going to the site, meeting with the landowner if possible, having a walk around, seeing where you think might be suitable to lay artificial cover objects. Again, making sure you've got permission from the landowner, the land manager, and potentially from Natural England if it's a protected site. If you do find that they are degrading or going missing, then you can report that in our kind of system, so we can keep track of that. Or if you need to move them to a new place, perhaps because the bracken's growing too much or the brambles. But I would advise, especially if you're working with some of the more conservation-oriented landowners, see if they're willing to kind of help contribute with that, and they also might have good ideas about where best to place them.
Thank you. And I think that is the last question in our chat. So I think we will just hand back over to Miranda to close the meeting.
Brilliant. Huge thank you to Rob and Karen. It's been really great to be introduced to our local amphibians and reptiles, and really useful to see all the details of how to participate in the recording, including the online aspects. Thank you to the audience for your questions. I've shared the link to the feedback survey in the chat. We'd really appreciate it if you have a bit of time to fill that out. As a bit of motivation, if you do complete the survey, there is a £50 prize draw to spend on wildlife equipment, so worth a few minutes of your time. And we will leave it there, so enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you all for coming along.